Today I want to talk to you about places in Scotland that are off the beaten path and could be great alternatives to some of the most popular destinations in Scotland, like the North Coast 500, Edinburgh, Glencoe and Oban. So stick around if you want to avoid crowds and experience Scottish regions that are lesser known, but by no means any less beautiful. My name is Kathy. I'm a travel writer based in Glasgow. I have a Scottish travel blog, a Scotland podcast, I plan bespoke itineraries, and on this channel I want to share with you my travel tips for Scotland and take you along on some of my adventures. As someone who works in the Scottish tourism industry, I certainly won't complain about the rise in tourist numbers to Scotland in recent years. However, there are some drawbacks to those increased visitor numbers, especially in some of the best known areas of Scotland. Places like the North Coast 500 in the North West Highlands, Edinburgh or the Isle of Skye are on the one hand dependent on the jobs and income produced by the tourism industry, but on the other hand those visitor numbers can put a real strain on local communities and their resources. Tourism and how to deal with over-tourism is quite a delicate conversation, and I really don't think I can solve the problem and offer a solution with one YouTube video. But I do think that by talking about lesser known areas of Scotland, those regions off the beaten path, I can hopefully encourage tourists to consider other regions to visit in Scotland and help distribute those visitor numbers a bit more equally across the country. Before we get to my Swapsies Destinations though, I want to make one thing really clear. Well, two actually. First, I am certainly the last person to talk you out of visiting a place like the Isle of Skye or Loch Ness. If you've done your research and for whatever reason you decided that that's really a place you want to visit, by all means go ahead and do that. I don't want to scare you off or talk you out of anything. But as an itinerary planner, I have come across many clients who told me they want to visit these places without really having a reason for it. They didn't really know why. The main cause was that they had heard those place names before, so they recognised them, and they simply didn't know what other regions are out there and are available to them for their itineraries. So I hope to address that information gap today by telling you about places that are equally as beautiful, but a bit more off the beaten path, so you can make a better choice for your Scotland itinerary. The second thing I want to make very clear before I get to my alternative suggestions is that all the places I mentioned today are worth visiting, whether they are on the popular list or on the alternative side of destinations I'll talk about. I really don't mean to say don't go here or don't go there. It's just about offering a few alternative ideas. So with all that out the way, let's look at 4 popular destinations in Scotland and some of the alternatives I like to visit. Now, the first destination I want to talk about is the North Coast 500 in the North West Highlands, starting from Inverness and then going round in a loop either clockwise or anti-clockwise towards Ullapool and the far northwest in Durness. The North Coast 500 is beautiful and I have driven it in parts or in its entirety multiple times, and it's definitely worth a visit. It's a very popular place to go with a motorhome or a camper van, but it's also a very remote part of Scotland with lots of small communities and not necessarily the kind of tourism infrastructure that is made for the numbers of visitors the region actually sees every year. Now, Scotland is full of beautiful road trips and roads that are great for road trips, whether they're coastal or in the mountains or anything in between. Not all of them necessarily have a brand name attached to them like the North Coast 500. Not all of them have a name or a specific set route that is very easy to market. But that doesn't mean that other roads and other road trips in Scotland aren't just as beautiful as the North Coast 500. One of the places I really love to visit is actually the Kintyre Peninsula, which is almost as far from the North Coast 500 as you can possibly go on the west coast of Scotland. Kintyre is the finger-shaped peninsula you see on the west coast of Scotland, kind of pointing south towards Ireland. The biggest towns on the Kintyre Peninsula are Campbelltown in the south and then Tarbert at the north end of the peninsula. The place named Tarbert actually refers to a very narrow piece of land connecting the peninsula to the mainland, and that's exactly where the narrowest bit of the peninsula, I think it's just a couple of miles across, is near the village of Tarbert. So that's where Kintyre officially begins. What I like about it is that it actually feels similarly remote as the northwest of Scotland, because it's not a through drive destination. You don't go to Kintyre to get anywhere else. You really have to make the effort. When you go to Kintyre, that's where you want to go and visit. It means you don't have the same kind of through traffic as you do in other more central areas of the west coast and the Highlands of Scotland. In Kintyre, you'll find lots of stunning sandy beaches, some of which are really well known among surfers. You can also go island hopping to anywhere from Islay and Jura on the west coast to the tiny Isle of Gia, or even Arran on the east coast in the Firth of Clyde. All those islands are within very simple and easy reach by boat. Campbelltown especially is a really unique whisky region in Scotland as well. There used to be well over 30 distilleries in this very small town. Today there's fewer of them, but they are on the rise again. That whisky region is really seeing a kind of renaissance. So if you like Scottish whisky and want to try some unusual or unique whiskies, the Kintyre Peninsula is definitely a place to visit. If you're into active travel and outdoor activities, you can spend a few days hiking the Kintyre Way or explore the peninsula by bike. I find that the roads are small enough and there's really not a lot of traffic, which makes it a great and safe and easy cycling destination, even if you're not a hardcore cyclist. You can also hire e-bikes in Campbelltown. Kintyre does actually have a branded road trip route as well. It's called the Kintyre 66. And even though it's only 66 miles, it definitely pays off spending a few days exploring different parts of the route. And like I said, go hiking, go cycling, go island hopping, do a whisky tasting, do all the things that the peninsula has to offer. One of my favourite things about the Kintyre Peninsula is that there are lots and lots of community tourism initiatives. So local people are really involved in the development of tourism on the peninsula, with the idea to avoid some of the issues that over-tourism causes in other regions of Scotland. If you'd like to know more about community tourism and how local communities are actively shaping the development of tourism in Scotland, I recommend listening to a conversation I had with Russell Fraser from the Loch Ness Hub on my podcast, Wild for Scotland. If you'd like to be a responsible traveller, someone who makes genuine connections with the people of the places you visit, then community tourism should really be something to learn about, and this podcast episode is really a good place to start. I'll pop the link below for you to listen. The next place I'd like to talk about is Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland. It's a very popular place to visit. It's the second most visited city in the UK, in fact, after London. And it makes sense. Many people arrive into Edinburgh Airport and make Edinburgh the first or last stop of their Scotland trip. And just to remind you, I'm not saying don't visit Edinburgh, I'm just saying there are other cities to visit out there in Scotland, especially during the summer months when Edinburgh can get very busy and super expensive, for example in August when all the festivals are on. My suggestion for an alternative city to visit in Scotland is Aberdeen on the northeast coast, about 3.5 hours by train from either Edinburgh or Glasgow. The cool thing about Aberdeen is that just as in Edinburgh, where you have the old town and the new town in the city centre, you kind of get two cities with one stone. There is Old Aberdeen, which grew around the University of Aberdeen, which has medieval cobbled lanes, a beautiful cathedral, and romantic bridges over the River Don. And then you have New Aberdeen, which is the granite city or the silver city. It's mostly built from local granite that can be kind of grey, but when the sun shines, really looks almost silver in the sunlight. It's a lot more grander and more modern 18th, 19th century modern architecture in the same way, or in a similar way, to the new town in Edinburgh. Aberdeen is very easy to get to by train or even by plane from some European cities, and it's well worth exploring for a few days. There's a big city, it's the third largest in Scotland, and there are many things that you can do and experience in Aberdeen and along the coast from it. One thing that Aberdeen doesn't have, that Edinburgh has, is that central medieval castle. However, Aberdeen is surrounded by a region called Aberdeenshire, and in Aberdeenshire you find the Scottish Castle Trail. Overall, Aberdeenshire has over 300 castles on offer, and the Scottish Castle Trail connects some of the best known and most beautiful castles in the region. Among them are some of my favourites, Dunotter Castle, for example, on the edge of Stonehaven, only about a 20-minute drive from Aberdeen, or the pink fairy tale castle at Craigievar, which is said to have inspired Walt Disney and his Disney castle. So if you find that Edinburgh may be too busy or too expensive for your trip, I do think that Aberdeen makes for a great alternative city trip in Scotland. The next place I want to talk about is Glencoe in the Highlands and the nearby town of Fort William. Both of these places are very popular for a very good reason, especially Glencoe, and that is that it's absolutely breathtaking. The mountain scenery, the dramatic views down the glen, being near the coast. It's a really beautiful place to visit. And I actually have a huge soft spot for Glencoe because I got married there. However, both Fort William and Glencoe can get really busy, especially during the summer months. And the reason for that is that Glencoe and Fort William are along one of the main roads through the Scottish Highlands. Anyone who wants to go to the Isle of Skye, or a bit further north towards Loch Ness, or elsewhere on the west coast, most of those people will come along that road and drive through Glencoe and Fort William. So it gets really busy with people who need maybe accommodation to spend a night somewhere in the Highlands before they move on further north or west. And it also gets busy with people who just want to stop along the viewpoints through the glen and in the wider area. So the car parks with those iconic views that you might know from pictures online get super, super busy with people. And some of the easier and better known hiking trails can also get quite busy with day hikers as well. So even though I think it's a beautiful place to visit, there are also alternatives out there, especially if you want an active holiday and just spend time out in nature and in the mountains without feeling like there's loads of crowds and lots of traffic on the roads. And two of my favourite places to do this, they're very close to each other, so I'm going to kind of lump them together a little bit, are Aviemore and the nearby area of Glenmore in the Cairngorms National Park, and the region of Badenoch, which is just south of Aviemore, around villages like Kincraig, Kingussie and Newtonmore. Between the two, Aviemore definitely gets a bit more traffic and is a bit more busy than Badenoch, but I think still for an active holiday out in nature, both of these locations are a really great alternative to Glencoe. In Badenoch, you can hike in the Mona Lea Mountains, which means the Grey Mountains, and you get beautiful views over to the Mona Rua Mountains, which means the Red Mountains, and is actually the Gaelic name of the Cairngorms and the Cairngorms National Park. You can walk among tall Caledonian pine trees, you can see lots of wildlife, learn about history and rural life at the Highland Folk Museum, and see lots and lots of small places away from the masses, away from the kind of tourist magnets further west in the Highlands. It's a really wonderful area, and even though many people travel through that part of Scotland along the A9 road, many people don't make the effort to actually leave the main road and explore that part of the Highlands. Now, Aviemore and Glenmore are properly in the Cairngorms National Park and really offer quite a lot of what you would imagine from the national park. You can go hiking with reindeer, you can climb some of the peaks surrounding Loch Morlich, or you can just enjoy the sandy beach of Loch Morlich, which is a really unique and kind of wonderful experience to have a sandy beach in the middle of the mountains. Both of those areas are also quite easy to travel by public transport. So if you plan to have an active trip to Scotland and you want to hike and reach many hiking trails without a car, Badenoch and Aviemore with Glenmore are really good alternatives because many trails in Glencoe can actually be quite difficult to reach without your own transport. Now, the next Swapsies destination is Oban. And this one actually breaks my heart a little bit because I love Oban and I think it's one of the first places and one of my favourite places to visit on the Scottish West Coast. You really can't get around Oban if you're planning to take a ferry to many of the Inner Hebridean or some of the Outer Hebridean islands. But because it's such an important ferry hub, it can also get very busy. It's not the only reason, but that contributes to the increase of numbers. So unless you're really planning to island hop, I think there are other destinations you could consider that are on the west coast, give you that typical colourful harbour view, are full of fresh seafood and really allow you to take in the west coast of Scotland without the bustle and the often quite expensive prices that come with a trip to Oban. Now, I have two different destinations that I would suggest you swap out for Oban on the west coast. Personally, and if I had the time, I would go to the southwest of Scotland and visit the Solway coast of Galloway. If you look on the map, the Solway coast, or the southern coast of the southwest of Scotland, has quite a lot of peninsulas, and each of these peninsulas has its own character, has beautiful villages, nice landscape, and really something different to offer. Some of the towns you might want to look at there are Kirkcudbright, which is an artist town, Whithorn and Wigtown on the Machars Peninsula, or maybe Portpatrick, which is really on the west coast looking out and getting the most stunning west coast sunsets you could imagine. There are no ferries leaving from any of these places, apart from the ferry that goes down to Northern Ireland, so you don't get that busy ferry traffic. But you still get busy fishing harbours with lots of boats bringing in fresh seafood, pleasure cruises, and lots of people in their own little boats, stand-up paddleboards and kayaks. There's always a lot going on in these harbours. Along that entire coast you find beautiful beaches, really lovely coastal towns that do have that same colourful vibe that you're looking for. And yeah, there's just really beautiful landscapes and nature all around. One of my favourite places is the Machars Peninsula, which I already mentioned, with towns like Whithorn or the tiny Isle of Whithorn, or a hike to St Ninian's Cave. I think that's one of my favourite parts of Scotland, and it's really not very well known among international visitors, so there's not an awful lot of traffic, but still plenty to do and see. If you are under a bit more time pressure and don't want to drive all the way to the southwest coast, there is another place I recommend to swap out for Oban, and that's the East Neuk of Fife. The Kingdom of Fife is a region just north of Edinburgh, and the East Neuk is the part of the coast just south of St Andrews. There's a row of fishing villages there from Crail to Ely. One is more beautiful than the other. They all have beautiful architecture, colourful houses, busy harbours. There's a coastal path that connects all of them, so you can explore on foot or by bus, as well as by car. And I think those villages offer quite a lot for a very short distance that you actually have to drive from places like Edinburgh or Glasgow. Tour companies like Rabbies even offer day trips there, but it is worth spending a few days and really exploring all of those villages and all they have to offer for a few days. And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed our journey to some of the lesser known places around Scotland that you can swap for some of the more popular destinations like the North Coast 500, Edinburgh, Glencoe and Oban. I'm already working on the second part of this series, and next time we're going to look at 4 more popular places and some of the Swapsies destinations I suggest. We're going to talk about the Isle of Skye, Loch Ness, Loch Lomond and Lewis and Harris in the Outer Hebrides. Subscribe now to make sure that you don't miss that second part. If you'd like to hear and see more from me, whether that's audio, video or written content, you can join the Wild for Scotland Social Club, which is my Patreon community. It costs only £3 per month to become a member, which is like buying me a coffee for this hopefully very helpful video. In the meantime, stay tuned for more tips from Scotland.